use the HAT framework. You could use person, environment, or occupation framework. So there's pieces that come from several different places depending on what textbook you're going by. But I'll go with the SET framework that Joy Zavala has shared for the last 20 years. And like I said, it starts with the student or client or human, however you want to put that person, the environment that they're functioning in, and the task they want to perform. And once you begin collecting data on those pieces, then we can problem solve tools. I mean, I'll make just a silly reference since my heart belongs in the ocean. If the environment that the person was going to do a ton of their alternate access to communication devices was right there on the beach or on a boat or in the ocean, then that's a massive environmental consideration that's going to affect the tool set and might have us choosing low-tech, non-electronic options as part of their system, right? That seems like a no-brainer, but the amount of times that if we don't stop and pause, actually, I'm involved in an OGCOM evaluation coming up this coming weekend, and my partner and I did an intake, and the mom talked about not wanting any device that has Bluetooth or Wi-Fi that can't be turned off, right? And so as a practitioner, I'm like, ooh, all right, so devices like an iPad inside of a case with an amplification system like a Via Pro, right? That just kind of took a notch down and went off the table because the amplification for that communication device is through Bluetooth on a speaker on the back of that case. And if the parent doesn't want their child exposed to the radiation that comes with Bluetooth by her choice, by that family's choice, that's really an environmental factor that I have to consider and is going to potentially change or limit the possible augmentative communication device or system. So I have to keep that in mind because that's a environmental restriction that the family is putting on. So let's talk mostly about the student or the human or the person, and I'm going to start with sensory. And I don't think I did. All right. When it comes to sensory, the main idea I'm thinking of is what the person can hear or see, right? If a person has a mild visual impairment and can't see small font or small icons, that immediately has an effect on the language, I guess I should say that the symbol set or language that the person can see on a communication device. And so even though it might not be alternate access yet, it might be alternate visual presentation or a limitation of how many buttons they can see on the screen, limiting from, like 84 or 96 button layout down to 12 or 20 because of enhancing the size, or having a system that as a person makes choices, it enhances the size of the button so they can see it better if their motor pattern doesn't allows them to memorize things. So you can see how just a small visual impairment may have a profound effect on communication. From a hearing impairment perspective, what if the person can't hear the message being delivered? How do they know that they've pushed a button that now gets someone else's attention? And of course, there are devices that have a visual presentation on the back of the device. So if the communication partner that is in that person's life has a hearing impairment, then they can have a visual presentation. So all of those little factors that we go, but what does this have to do with communication? Well, it has everything, right? It has everything to do with communication because it's the gestalt, it's the whole of the situation. So I really like to set framework to kind of lay that foundation. So hearing and vision, as an OT, I'd be remiss if I don't talk about sensory defensiveness or sensory preferences. I don't think that there's a huge impact of that on communication devices per se, but it is something to be aware of. If a person has tactile defensiveness and doesn't like to touch things, then that may impact their ability to choose a device that involves touch interface. So just something to keep in the back of your mind, but not something I've seen even like our kiddos with autism that often have high levels of sensory defensiveness. They typically don't have an issue with reaching out and touching the screen, although they may have an issue with stimming on the screen and pushing the screen multiple times. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later on how we can change up the screen settings that would allow that touch to be ignored. From a cognition perspective, this massively overlaps, obviously, between speech professionals and motor professionals, is the ability to follow directions, the ability to understand those directions, comprehension, and then execution, the executive functioning that goes along with understanding how to use a communication device, whether the person is charging it on their own or whether someone else in the environment is charging it for them, having it taken out, turned on, open to a communication page set if it's a device that allows multiple things to be used, which typically is rare, right? Normally we try and do the it's my voice device, not it's my voice and other things, but we do know as kids age or as adults use things that they understand they've got their voice and they've got, they can have multiple things on one device. I know for our youngers, we tend to avoid that. But the cognition that goes with using a device, like I said, following those directions and implementing that's huge, and impacts maybe a starting point where we presume competence with communication, but we're hedging our bets and making sure that our cognitive expectations are in line with what we think the person is able to do. And then there's motor, which of course is where the motor therapist makes their big bucks, right? I like to say that, cooking starts with being able to open the fridge and open the pantry and open the spices, all of those things. If you can't open the containers, it really doesn't matter what you want to cook, right? But once we have the cabinet open, the refrigerator open, the jar of pickles open, whatever it is, once we have those containers open, you can make anything, right? So you can have the most robust kitchen with everything available under the sun, right? Make Chef Ramsay super happy, right? He can have all those options in the fridge, freezer, pantry, whatever. But if you don't have the skill set to open the refrigerator door, then it doesn't matter what's on the other side, right? So that robust communication is interdependent and married with a good motor therapist, making sure that access is not precluding that robust communication. So I have this activity, and let's see, actually you can still see me off to the side. So I just grabbed a piece of paper that I had on the table and tore it down. And I will preface this by saying, don't participate in this activity if you are pregnant, have a bad back, have vertigo, have any kind of contraindicated medical, vestibular kinds of things going on. I'm gonna trust you to use your judgment. You can actually do this activity. You can do steps 1, 5, and 6 if you have any kind of balance issues. You can still do 1, 5, and 6. You would just skip the 2 and 3 and 4. But the premise is, and of course I can't move my camera real well to show my whole body, but the premise is that I want you to be in a very unstable position. I want you to move your butt up to the front of the chair. I want you to lift your feet off so that you're balancing kind of on your sacrum, right? On your hips there, on your sacrum. I'm not leaning back on my chair. I don't have my feet on the ground. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece of paper and I'm going to try and write Matthew. And I got to think really hard which way the A goes. And I'm going to keep going. And I'm writing it. Ooh, let's see, I'm going the wrong way. Let's see. I actually wrote it mostly right. Let's see, I'll move it up to the camera. We'll see. My spacing stinks because I overlapped my letters. My line placement, right, for the OT that's in the room, right? My line placement, my letters are actually fairly even straight across the line. And you go, wait, how do you do that? You're writing on your forehead backwards, right? I had to think really hard which way the A was going to open because I'm writing it so that you can see it instead of me. The backwards writing is unique to educators, right? Therapists and educators who sit across the table and are working on handwriting skills and are teaching students to form the letters properly, and they're writing them upside down and backwards from across the table. So yes, thank you, Shannon. That's one of the things that I think pediatric therapists and educators get really good at. But writing on the forehead just adds that extra dynamic because you can't see it, right? And you can kind of feel it, but you're not feeling it from a handwriting perspective where it's the motor pattern that you're going with. Throw in more people with a strong core, right? So why did we do this activity, right? Why would I have you write on your forehead backwards so that the person across from you can see it, and put yourself in a weak core position, right? Why would we do that? Oh, I like that, Shannon. Thank you. A great way to get us to think about the challenges of our students and clients. Anybody else want to jump in and add on or throw other ideas? Well, I think Shannon is right, and Carolyn, with your core comment, is right too. The whole idea of this is that if you're not in a good position to start, motor movement is harder. And I think we all know that, right? Like it becomes obvious, like if you're trying to balance and reach and then do something specialized, like I said, racquetball is one of my favorite things, right? When I get my feet set and a weight shift, when I go to swing, I do great. But if I'm running to get to the ball and I can barely get a racket on it, I'm not taking a great shot, which means I'm not going to win that point, or I'm keeping it alive for another hit, maybe depending on my opponent, right? So when we start to think about communication and augmentative communication, right? If a person isn't positioned well, then that means that whatever part of their body, sorry, I get a phone call in the middle of presentation, go to voicemail. Whatever part of their body is being used to access the device is not going to be primed. It's not going to be optimally positioned if their core isn't optimally positioned. In therapy school, they teach us proximal stability leads to distal mobility, right? And that's like the fancy way of saying, hey, if your core is supported, if your hips, your back, your shoulders, if all of your core is supported, then it makes all of this movement out here or this movement up here way easier, right? And that's what we want, is we want efficiency for our clients when it comes to access. So these should be really obvious, I think, for most speech and motor professionals, is we've got a person. And then when we start to talk about the system that we're trying to work with, we've got a communication device, which is right there in the middle, big black box. We have a mounting system for some of our clients. Sometimes the mounting systems are super complicated with swing away components, with multiple positioning, multiple placements on a mount, but most of the time they're rather static and they're meant to be kept in a very specific relationship between the user and the device. Whether that's from a visual presentation or a motor presentation, right? We often want the device to be a certain amount of distance from the person so that they can see it well, an angle that avoids glare. And then from a motor access perspective, if they're reaching out and touching it, we don't want it too far away from them because now they're doing a lot of work to reach against gravity, but we don't want it too close to them either to where it's not motor efficient for them and their arms aren't supported. So the components that we're really looking at are that device itself, a mounting system where appropriate, and then an access device, which in this picture happens to be a switch. I should have got a side angle of this one to show that it's up near her head. To me, it's not in a great position based on where her head angle is, but I think she was excited when the picture was taken. So she's way far away from where the switch normally would be. And we'll talk about why that's good or bad in a few moments. Oops, why did that go that way? All right. So as we start to transition from the student component into the motor feature match of choosing that alternate access, we moved out of sensory, motor, and cognition, and now we're going to get deeper into motor and tool together. Our goal is to find the easiest way for the student to access the device through what they have available to them physically, because that's what they're going to use to access that device, right? So we want to maximize their communication potential, maximize their cognitive skills, and let the physical or motor skills be automatic, as automatic as possible, right? We don't want them thinking. So like when you think back to the activity where you were writing on your forehead, right? If you were doing that activity like I was, although I've done it 100 times now, a lot of times you're thinking about keeping your balance, right? Instead of thinking about writing your name, right? So if your brain power is split between keeping your balance and writing your name and writing it backwards on your forehead, which is maybe a new task, right? And communication through a device might be a new task for many people, right? If your brain power is split between thinking about the motor part and thinking about the communication part, then you're losing the ability to focus on communication because you're wasting brain space on the motor part. So that's why we want it to be the easiest. We want it to be automatic. We want motor planning to do its thing and where you're not thinking about it. Just like for most of us when we type on a keyboard, right? We don't think about where's the A, where's the B, where's the C. And once we've been doing it for a while and we learn the keyboard layout, our fingers just go and we don't really think about where they're going. They just do their thing. That's how we want access to communication device to be. So direct selection, 99% of the time, probably like 99.9% of the time, is faster and easier than going into indirect selection. And what direct selection means is using some form of the body to interact with the device without restrictive movement patterns or a timing pattern, a timing component. So like a lot of people think, well, if I reach out and touch the switch, because I'm going to jump right there, that's directly touching the switch. And so therefore I'm controlling the device. The problem with that, and we'll get to that, a further definition in a minute, is that there's a pattern to what that switch can do. It's very limited. And there's a timing component to single switches that is very restrictive. Right, so direct selection says, no, none of those things are in place. So if I were using eye gaze to access my computer, the same way we would use it to access a communication device, I can look anywhere on the screen and access a button in whatever order I choose. The timing is based on me and my eyes looking around the screen. And with eye gaze, there is a component of how long you have to dwell or hover before it clicks, although I guess we could use a switch for that too, but we'll come back to that. Head pointing is the same way. As I turn my head, instead of using my eyes to look at the screen, it's still me in direct control of the device on the other end. Again, no movement pattern. I can turn my head and gaze my head point to any area of the screen at any time. And then, of course, what most people think of when they think of direct select is I just reach out and touch, just like we do on any kind of touchscreen device, is that I use some part of my body. I've had clients use their nose. I've had clients use, bent knuckles. I've had clients, wonderful ones, getting to use their index finger, and that's all great, but that's not right today's conversation, right? The easy ones don't need alternate access, but know that you can touch with multiple parts of the body, of course, right? And then don't forget that we could use a tool. So I don't have one in front of me, but like lots of pens that you pick up at the conferences now have like a stylus end. right? So I could reach out and touch it, and I could hold it like this, and I could hold it like this. I could have a stylus on the end of a mouth stick, so I'm holding it here. So just because I'm using a tool to touch the screen doesn't mean it's not direct access either, right? So the best part of that definition are that there's no restrictive movement patterns, and there's no restrictive timing component. And then indirect selection is what we really think of with switches. One switch scanning, two switch scanning, inverse scanning. And I think I'm going to show some patterns. Actually, all right, first I'll show Michael. So let me back this up. When we look at switch scanning, one switch scanning, it's just like it sounds. There's one single switch, one single surface that a person has to either come in proximity to or come in contact with to activate. And that switch is connected to the communication device and executes a series of events. Typically, that series of events is moving through a group of items and then into individual items. And I'm going to show that on the screen. So I think I'll pause there. Two switch scanning means that there are two different surfaces to come in proximity with or come in contact with, depending on the type of switch. And one switch moves you through the restrictive pattern, and a second switch says, yeah, that's the one I want, is a selector switch. So oftentimes when I'm working with my littles, it's the mover switch and the pick switch, the go switch. And then there's inverse scanning, which is seldom seen, I think, these days. I've never had a client with inverse scanning, only heard of it. But inverse scanning is, instead of hitting a switch and then letting it move through the pattern and then hitting it again to select, you hit the switch to start it and you hold it. And then when it gets to what you want, you let go. And I share that because it's built into a few of the different devices, and it's something important to know that if a person can activate but doesn't come off a switch very quickly, that might be something to consider, is coming off at a second point when it's timed. I'm going to share a video here. Let me see if I click on this, if it's actually going to bring it up. Oh, yay. I was worried that it might bring it up on my screen, but not bring it up on your screen. This is not an infomercial for VRBO. And I'm going to pause it in a second once we can see my. All right, so that's Michael up front. Michael has a body that does not work for him very well. He's actually laying on kind of a stretcher, a portable gurney hospital bed kind of thing. And he's connected to the computer that's just almost off screen on the bottom right corner, and it's projected. I think this was at ATIA probably 15 years ago. I'll let it play for a little bit and then talk more. All right, so you can see Michael's body does not work well for him. At this point, he's on a ventilator. But what I want you to see, we're going to zoom in a moment. There's a computer hanging over his head, and his left hand is his switch access. All right, so you're seeing all he's doing is this itty bitty minimal lateral movement of his thumb. He's got a fingernail painted so you can see the thumbnail in relation to that little yellow sensor. That is not a switch that you come in contact with. That's a proximity switch. So imagine, I'll go back to Florida. Imagine you're walking into Publix. We don't have those out here, but now my mind's thinking about Publix fried chicken. You walk into Publix, and as you walk up to the door, it opens for you, right? Most of the time, it opens when you're 5 or 6 feet away and you can walk straight through in stride. Every once in a while, the proximity sensor gets messed up, and it doesn't open until you're like yay far away from the door, and you basically have to stop. right? But there's that little sensor right up top over the door. And when something breaks the sensor field in front of there, then it executes its reactor, whatever it's plugged into, right? So the door at Fry's, the sensor, the proximity switch is connected to the motor that opens the door, and that's all it does. So every time you break the visual plane in front of that sensor, the door opens. So very simple cause and effect, not even hit the switch, right? Activate the switch, door opens, activate the switch, door opens, right? This is that same switch, except in a much smaller location and set to be, the proximity is set to be a fraction of an inch, because you'll see he rests his thumb very close to it and then just does this very small movement, as you'll see here.
Baby, I turn my back to I go through what I just felt. I try, I baby try.
All right, so Michael, as you can see, had spinal muscular atrophy. He's actually well, he's not that young man. He's only 3 years younger than me. Lives in Florida, lived in Florida. Really cool guy. What I'm showing you on the screen now is what was flashing really fast on his screen. So as he hit his switch, it was moving through this keyboard layout. And that's how he was able to type. That's how he was able to turn on iTunes. And so while this is not a communication device example, it's exactly what happens on our communication devices, right? So you can see up at the top, it says new features for beginning, and it's going through and picking, it's going through each row one at a time. So that would be a group. And then once the group is selected, it moves across to subgroups, right? So in that first row, when it's choosing that S, right, he was able to choose that first row with the A, and then the fourth group with the S, and then the fourth item with the S, right? So that's how his switch hits are working to make selections here, right? So if I was working with Michael, if I was evaluating Michael, the things that I'm starting with are his positioning, right? Even though his body is very complicated, it's also very simple in that most of it doesn't work. When you're working with a person with spinal muscular atrophy, and most of their muscles are not working, you don't have to worry about tone the way like working with a client with CP. We're going to have to work on really good positioning, inhibition of tone, and then what happens when they get excited and how their emotions and movement affect their tone and positioning. So where I'm going with that is positioning with someone with like a spinal cord injury, positioning with someone with motor loss as compared to motor excitement or a CP tone issues is going to be slightly different. But in general, that positioning starts with get me to a stable base of support, and then let's focus on really small movements. A couple of definitions here that are super important are reliability of movement. So that's my ability to replicate it over and over again, right? So if I was playing darts, the reliability of movement is, can I throw the dart at the dartboard over and over again? Can I do it at 6 a.m., 8 a.m., 10 a.m., noon, 2, 4, 6 p.m., or does my movement change throughout the day? The accuracy of movement is, can I hit the bullseye? Or am I on the next layer or the next layer or the next layer, right? So that accuracy of movement starts to give me information on how small a target I can hit, AKA switch size, as an example. Time to target is going to be really important. Imagine if you were working through those movement patterns and it took you forever to go from, ooh, I see what I want to when I get there. Is that going to be your scan rate, which we'll talk about in a minute? Latency is how long do you need before you can replicate that, right? So can I go like this and go boom, 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 boom? Or can I hit it once and then all of a sudden I need to rest and I can't hit it again, hit that switch again for a couple of seconds. And then fatigue, I kind of explained that a little bit with the reliability of movement. Some of our clients, what they can do at 8 in the morning is very different than what we can do at 8 p.m., right? When you look at a switch site and you're looking at picking a switch site, you want small isolated movements. You don't want, it's not I want to reach all the way out and touch. I want to put that switch right near so that all I have to do is move a finger to touch, not a wind up in the pitch kind of thing. It needs to be under as much control as possible. And again, super easy for the client to do. We don't, so that the picture that I put up at the very beginning, that head switch, if she's got good head control, I want that head switch almost touching her head, right? Because with the switch that we saw in that picture, we could easily, that one requires just a little bit of pressure to activate. So if I was laying against my head, I still have to tilt just enough to activate that switch, right? If she didn't have that much control, then we might move the switch just a little bit further. So that way, if she's moving her head in space, she's not activating the switch by accident. With that switch again, so that was like a jelly bean switch, and you can look up the different switch pressures that are required by talking to the manufacturers. But the jelly bean switch requires less than half a pound of pressure to activate. But still, for some of our clients, that's a lot of work. Versus the switch that you saw in the video with Michael, that one doesn't require any pressure because it's not being touched. It's a proximity switch. And then, of course, being able to come off the switch is just as important as being able to go onto the switch. Typically, our hands are our most dexterous, most controllable part of our body, followed by our head and sometimes our mouth. And then sometimes people forget that even though a person might have CP and be in a wheelchair, that their feet might actually have a really good shot at controlling a switch. And whether that's just above a foot or just below a foot, like you're pushing the gas pedal, as compared to you're lifting and dorsiflexing the foot and just coming in contact with a switch. Both of those directions. We could do lateral movement, although the ankle does a lot better with what's called dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, you know, straight up and down in front of us versus a side to side tilt. And then in general lower extremity, so I have seen where a person, instead of activating the switch with their foot, they were basically lifting their knee by getting on the ball of their foot, and there was a switch placed upside down on a lap tray just above the knee, and they would bring the knee up into it. These are the very few and far between kinds of things when you get to the feet, lower extremities, and upper extremities in general. And then, of course, the mind. What I'm referring to with the mind are things like neural switches. So things that you think about activating the muscle belly, you think about moving a body part, you think about raising an eyebrow, and that mind control, for lack of a nicer way to say it, will then send an electrical potential to a switch that activates a communication device. Again, these are really early on in development. If you really want to see like NeuroNode, go to ATIA and get to play at the booth, but you're going to need an hour for that one by itself. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because I see where I'm at with time, because I want to go here. So when we talk about alternate access, I'm not spending a ton of time on eye gaze or head pointing because those have come so far most recently that I think most communication device vendors can give you a really good dog and pony show on how to set up and do eye gaze. I think switch scanning is much harder. And I think that's where understanding how to pick the switch and the scanning rate and the scanning pattern is important. So I want to spend just a little bit more time here. So a scan pattern is as it sounds, the pattern that it moves through the options that you're able to pick. And we're going to look at some examples. The scan rate is the speed. And the scan mode is the way the switch is used. That's where that inverse scanning comes in, but we're not going to spend much time there, right? So here, the scan pattern, I'm going to demonstrate linear scanning. And so I pretended to just hit a switch. I hit my space bar. We're going to imagine that that red delay is there for 1 second on each of these buttons, right? So if you want in the chat box, how long would it take to get to button, I don't know, 15, right? If we're doing 1 second on each of those buttons, and we want to go to button 15, how long would it take to get there? And how many switch hits would it take to choose? And I'm going with 15, even though it says number 9 on the screen. Oh, don't be bashful, guys. All right, this is the easy one, so I'm going to do it. It took 2 switch hits, one to start the scan, and then one to end the scan on the item I want, and it took 9 seconds, right? So on a linear scan, you've got to go one by one. Now, we don't have to do 1 second per button. We could start to do fractions of seconds, but that makes us have to math, and we'll skip the math lesson for now, right? But if we were saying, what if I need to hit button 23, right? Well, then that means that it takes 23 seconds to get there, but still only 2 switch hits, right? So as far as the amount of motor movement, we're still fairly low because it's 2 switch hits, but the amount of cognition to understand, I got to sit around and wait because it's going to get there eventually, that starts to go. Let's look at group item. So on the screen, I called it row column. But the reality of it is, depending on what country you're in, sometimes they do it backwards. I've been told over in the United Kingdom that they do more of column row than row column. And that was from a PRC vendor a few weeks ago. So I have not verified that with a client. But so group item means a group of things and then the items within that group. As we saw in Michael's video, his was group item because it was really a group and then subgroups and then items. But here we'll see group item going to button 16. I really do want you to think about this. How many seconds will it take to get to button number 16? And how many switch hits will it take to get to button number 16 if we're scanning row and then the individual columns across? I'm gonna give you a minute. I'm hoping I'll get some responses in the chat box. Or you can unmute yourself and throw it out there out loud if you want to. And that way it's not tied to your name in the chat box. That's okay too. Oh, I like that. Someone's calculated. I think you're very close, if not perfect, right on, right? Let's see. So I'm going to hit the switch to start it. And we know we're going to hit the switch in the 3rd row. And then we'll hit the switch on the 16. So 3 hits is definitely 100% correct. Now let's figure out the timing. So I'm going to hit that switch. All right, so row 1 is a second, row 2 is a second, row 3 is a second, 13 is a second, 14 is a second, 15, 16. So we can go with anywhere between roughly 5 and 7 seconds. And the reason I say that is because when it gets to the 3rd item, if you're super ready, you don't have to wait that entire second to select the 3rd row. And then as it goes through, when it gets to that 4th item, you don't have to wait that full second to get there. So definitely 1, 2, partial of 3, 4, 5, 6, partial of 7, right? So 5 to 7 seconds to get there. Well, that was way faster than getting to the 9th button, right? When we were doing the linear scan pattern, the 9th button took 9 seconds. The 15th took 15, 23 took 23, because you got to wait for it to go through all of those if that's our scan rate, right? But this one was much more efficient from a timing perspective, but it was less efficient from a motor perspective, right? So this is where we're going to start things. Here's a total quiz question. We know that the first button in this scan pattern is going to be your most important thing because it's right there at the first spot. Where would the next 2 most important buttons be? What numbers would they be in this scan array? It's a little tricky, but I think you guys are going to get it. I don't have Jeopardy music to play in the background, so it's just lonely, quiet here. I should have gotten my Jeopardy music. Oh, okay, interesting. We're getting a little bit of different answers. So with a group item, the buttons that you can get to the fastest would be number 1. The second fastest would be the first group second item, which would be in this array, button number 2, or the second group first item, which would be button number 7. So those would be the quickest ones to get to, as far as they're both going to require the same amount of switch hits. And they're both going to require the same amount of time, right? So interestingly, it's going to start with 1 and then 2 and 7 diagonally. The next things, right, I need a class on just this. This is where it takes some time, and things like core scanner are super important if we're using someone who's using switches. That's where I'm headed with this, right? So 1 and then 2 and 7, and then 3, 8, and 13, and 4, 9, 14, and 19. So it goes diagonally from top left towards the bottom right, because you're getting further into the pattern, either down or over, right? So I should have pulled up a picture. Let's see real quick. We'll go to Google, and I'm gonna put up bear with me, I'm on Google. We'll see what pops up, right? And actually, I want a better. All right, yay. All right, so I'm going to show you the early part of Core Scanner. And what I want you to pay attention to is the color coding that you see here, right? The color coding that you see, right? So blue is going to be all of the items in the first group. Orange is going to be all of the items in the second group. So now I'm going to fast forward down here to the bottom, right? It looks like it won't make it any bigger for me, but hopefully what you're seeing is where it says jam here. So if I want an item that's associated with the word more, I would have picked the blue button, and then it's going to start scanning the items inside of that group, right? If I had wanted the items in the stop button, it would scan basically this first group, and I'd say, nope, don't want that. Then it would go to the second group, and everything associated with stop would then be in there, and it would scan item by item through there. So the reason I'm pointing this out is a lot of times our language system is set up from left to right, right? Because how do we read? How is language organized? Typically left to right. So like if I jumped to a completely different language-based layout, and if anyone familiar with PRC would go, yeah, that's not how it's laid out in a normal, like a Unity or a LAMP type layout, or even word power type layout. And I promise I'm not related to any vendors. It's just the one I'm most familiar with. So when you look at this one, you go, wait a minute, the vocabulary is organized very, very differently. Yes, because this is a scanner's layout. Right, so this is where the motor therapist and the communication therapist have to get on that same page, because if you're not, then the motor therapist is going, I need motor efficiency. I need it to be set up for the least amount of switch hits and the fastest amount of time to get to your message. But as a speech therapist, more of you are concerned with the language part, right? So if we can't open the refrigerator door analogy back to the cooking, this is where the refrigerator door meets the client, meets the food on the inside, right? All those things come together. So if you're using a switch scanner, if you're helping a client who's going to be a switch scanner, you want to pause and really understand the different language layouts on the different devices that are switch scanner friendly, as compared to any other alternate access. That's that direct access. You don't have to reorganize the language. And that's just a huge important pause moment, right? is that knowing that the layout of the what's on the screen for the person to pick from has everything to do with motor efficiency under that switch scanning layout. So that's why it's way different. I'd be remiss if I don't come back to the one switch and the two switch scanning. So right now I showed you a scan pattern and I talked about a scan timing. Scan timing has everything to do with only having one switch site. And what that means is that you hit that one switch and it starts moving through the pattern on a timing component. And it could have been a quarter of a second. So it would be moving really fast. Like on Michael's screen, I can't even tell you how fast his scan rate was because I couldn't follow it fast enough. But on the PowerPoint slide where I showed you, you could see it moving fast, but not as fast as Michael's, but not as slow as my 1 second per button demonstration with the red and blue, right? So with one switch scanning, it means all you've got is one target to hit, but you're stuck at the rate of movement. You can do whatever pattern you want. So you can do a linear scan pattern like you saw with the red boxes in the first one where it went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But you could also do group item. Like I said, row column here in the United States is probably the most common one. Although I should have put a fourth example would be group subgroup item. And then when you're off of the communication devices, toolbar and button is another way of saying group item. So you'll see that on your on-screen keyboards if you're using switch scanning off of there. But one switch has everything to do with timing. And it doesn't mean that if I do a timing assessment and I say, you know, hit the switch, make the bunny move or whatever, and it takes you 2 seconds to reach out and touch, it doesn't mean that that has to be the same as the scan rate. Because if the person can predict their button is coming and goes, ooh, it's on button 1, and I know it takes me 2 seconds to get there, and what I want is on button 3, if they start their movement on button 1, then we can move at 1 second per button instead of 2 seconds per button because they're going to move and get there at the right time. But again, the cognitive load now for being able to do that is super high, right? So understanding that difference. If we move to 2 switches, that means there's no timing component. I'm going to move through the same pattern. So that left side of the screen with linear scanning or group item is still 100% relevant with 2 switch scanning because you move through the pattern. But the 2 switches means instead of having the timing, I might move, and then pick. And I might move, and have a delay, and then pick with the same hand, same access point with both switches. It doesn't mean you have to have 2 different sites. It means you have 2 different switches. So again, just a little dynamic there. If you want to go really deep into scanning, Linda Burkhart is absolutely hands down amazing. As is, oh my gosh, someone else's name with red hair. Why can't I think of her? Karen Kangas is also really lovely at explaining switches, although Karen Kangas goes faster than I go. And I think I'm going pretty fast, but Karen goes really, really fast. But both of those, you live in Florida, you got ATIA every year, and often pre-conference presentations by one or both of those are people that you can go to learn more and more. I'm happy to continue the conversation via email or text message or phone call too, but I know that I'm bleeding on time here. So looking back at this, you can see the scan rate is probably about a quarter, a third of a second as it moves through all of those options. The scan pattern is group item, and you can't tell what he's using in this case because it's just a script on a screen. You can't tell that he's using one switch, but we know that because there's a timing pattern, a timing component, right? I'm gonna glaze over this in 5 minutes. Switch mounting is important in that sometimes the switch can be placed on a tray in front of a person. So like in this particular situation, I can tell you that she's super excitable and she does a lot of whole arm swinging movement. Anyone working with kids with CP probably would recognize that right away. That's why the switch is way off to the far left. She has great cognitive understanding because she knows the switch is there and doesn't need to look at it to activate it. She can visually attend to the device in front of her and know that she can swing her arm and hit it off to that left side and activate the switch that's controlling that device. From a mounting perspective, the two main types of mounts are either fixed or flexible. Gooseneck is the fairly flexible kind. The latest trend in that is PVC mounting with very flexible tips, or very flexible neck type systems or arm type systems. Oh my gosh, the name of that company is going to elude me, but it'll pop in my head. And then there's joints. So when you look at a mount like this one, that black circle to the right of the device is a joint. It actually allows that bar to swing away. So if we took the lap tray off, let's see, if we took the lap tray off, this part of the device could literally swing 90 degrees up so that we could transfer her out of the chair. That's super important when you're thinking about clients that are getting in and out of the chair a lot, and or being changed by a caregiver a lot as well. And those joints can be fixed with nuts and bolts, but they can also have knobs and levers so that they can be manipulated. So like during an evaluation, I like nothing to be fixed because I want to figure out where it needs to go. And I'm going to use knobs and levers to tighten it. But some of our vendors, when you order the mount, will allow you to switch out the knobs and levers for nuts and bolts so that when you get it there, now it's going to stay. Caregivers aren't going to move it. Loosening of nuts or bolts isn't going to move it. Like, so over time, or I'm sorry, loosening of knobs or levers isn't going to move it. So that nut and bolt holds it in place where it's supposed to be. And then the base connection, you actually can't see the base connection. It's right down here off the bottom of the chair, and that's how it attaches to whatever surface. So sometimes we do like a table mount or a rolling floor mount, and there really is no base connection. It's the base of the rolling floor mount or the stand on the table. Sometimes they have Velcro or suction to hold themselves down, and that's enough. Other times we got a clamp. So Velcro or suction obviously is subject to easier removal, easier misplacement or misalignment with the person, whereas clamps and plates, if I have it clamped to the wheelchair, we're not taking that part off, which means that it's always going to stay in that direct relationship. So depending on who I'm working with, I can change my base connector depending on who I'm working with and what their motor skills are. It's all about stabilizing when it comes to the communication device itself, and mobility of the person, and maintaining the relationship to the person. So for her, you always want that switch to be in that same spot if her arm is 99% of the time going to stay fully extended, right? So because of her tone, her arm stays at an extensor, in an extensor pattern, right? So that means that that switch can stay at that full distance because when she's trying to activate it, she's excited, her tone is overflowing, and she stays in an extensor pattern. So that relationship of where the switch is to the user, super important. Think about that with Michael in his proximity switch. If you went and moved that box with that yellow sensor an inch to the right, his hand is placed on that gurney and all he's moving is his thumb. Someone would have to physically come and either move his hand closer to that proximity switch or move the proximity switch closer back to him. So that relationship for where the motor pattern, motor movement is happening is so important. And then removability of the mount. Most mounts nowadays have like a quick release spot where the mounting base stays in one spot and a pole can come off and it locks back in that same position. So that part's been kind of solved over the last 10 years, but they're much easier to either swing away or remove for transportation. The buses do not like mounts on the wheelchairs with communication devices. They like those things taken off for safety reasons, even though that means it also takes our voice away on the bus. So I'm not a huge fan, but safety, I guess, has to go first. A bunch of companies, Lockline is the name of the mount that has the gooseneck Lockline down there. So I'm not going to go any further into those. Those are kind of the main mounting companies that are out there. And then the last thing, and this has less to do with, it has everything to do with communication, but not the communication device. And meaning that if we are using switches we have to teach the person that that relationship between the moving switch and the picking switch does something on the screen. So sometimes that's going to happen on the communication device. Sometimes it's going to happen off the communication device, and it might be something that we build before we get deeper into building language. Because what we're doing is we're focusing on opening the refrigerator door, right? So we're not quite to cooking yet. We're practicing the opening of that door. So a causal relationship is just like it sounds, cause and effect. Every time I hit the switch, something happens, right? And I can easily say to you, well, the first switch is the mover switch. So every time you hit it, the effect is it moves. But to someone else, understanding that relationship when language might be impaired, cognition might be impaired, it's tougher, right? So we might do things. So if I start talking about switch toys or a fan or a radio, anything that can be turned on, a blow dryer, right? If I can hit my switch and I get a blow dryer, or I hit my switch and the blow dryer blows on bubbles, or I hit my switch and my blow dryer gets turned on and blows on a pinwheel, or I hit my switch and the blow dryer blows on some kind of really light car or fluffy pom-pom art kind of activity, and it rolls across the table. These are the things that we might do to help motivate the client to hit the switch and get that effect. And that would be both at the causal relationship, and I'm going to jump into phase two, the motor automaticity, which AKA just means practice, 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 right? So can I share the list of switch resources again? Actually, I just did I didn't put the switch companies on here. I don't think I did that on here, but AbleNet is a switch company, as well as, it'll come to me in a minute, the other main one that I got to think of. Let me jump back into tool use and then I'll go there. But AbleNet is one of the main companies, and Enabling Devices is the other main switch company where you're going to get most of your switches. So let me actually go to this screen. So learning to use switches, beginning to get that causal relationship. Like I said, the blow dryer, I hit it and I get, air blown in my face. And then that motor automaticity is I'm hitting the switch and getting practice after practice after practice. The timing component, right? So when we're thinking about a communication device and moving through a pattern, if I've only got one switch, then timing becomes really important. So can you hit the switch to make something happen for a certain amount of time? So could I hit the switch if imagine, this is a bad example because I don't know that it would work physically, but it's easier to visually comprehend. If I had a blow dryer and I had a Matchbox car on the desk, and the desk is fairly level because we don't want it rolling on its own. If I could hit the switch and the blow dryer goes on and it blows the car, but I want to release the switch before the car rolls off the table, right? Or I could put an obstacle up, let the car roll, but don't let it knock the blocks over, right? If the wind from the blow dryer was strong enough to knock the car into the blocks or knock the car off the table, right? So learning, ooh, I got to hit my switch and I have to come off it, right? Super important. That's that developing that timing. I'm completely comfortable with Carolyn sharing the PowerPoint because I can't get through all of it. I'm just talking too much. But I put some different ideas on how to develop some of these levels of switch implementation, because I could probably do like a 2-hour workshop on just that part, just the second half of this. And I put all these ideas in there. So that way you could see, so like one of my favorite things to do is like a Tar Heel Reader with switches, or a PowerPoint book with switches, because I can plug my switch into a computer and make the switch be the space bar, which would move me through my presentation, or the right arrow or the mouse click. There's lots of different ways to plug that in. But like I could have a PowerPoint book with pictures of the kid's favorite thing, and it only moves forward every time they hit the switch, right? So there are tons of switch development ideas, a few of which are on the screen. And that way it walks you through what I'm going through here in hyper speed, but you can go back and read it and see it at a little bit better speed. So yeah, actually put in, a snack time example of level 1, level 2, level 3, a spin art example, one of my favorites of level 1, level 2, level 3, story reading through like a Tar Heel Reader or PowerPoint books at a level 2 and 3. So that jumps me through. Caroline, I went over. I think probably the best thing would be to go straight to like questions and answers from the audience. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, but you can also unmute yourself because that might be a more efficient way of asking. But you're welcome to do it through the chat box as well. And if you want me to clarify something, I'm of course happy to do that too. So I'm going to put in the chat box, able net and enabling devices. Those are probably the two companies where most switches come from. You can go to other places, but these are the ones that make them. And again, like I said, disclosure wise, no relationship with any of these companies. They're the ones that my district happens to use the most, or that I'm most familiar with. So apologies in advance if someone's like, well, I use this other one. Please jump in and share it on there too, and that's okay.
Matthew, one of the questions that was in your Padlet was, which are the best switches to start with in an evaluation?
Great question. So a lot of that depends on what the person's motor ability is. So if we're talking about, I'll talk generically. If the person is really rough on switches, there are switches that are designed to absorb hits. Like a jelly bean switch is really durable. There are pillow switches where there's physical padding. It's a switch embedded in a small pillow, a 3-inch roughly round pillow, like the same size as the jelly bean. But so for a person who might be rough on hitting them for whatever reason, whether it's anger or CP with harder to control movement, then a switch that's durable. You can 3D print switches these days, but they're not super durable. So those ones are great for evaluations on clients with minimal motor movement. I like to have in my switch kit something that's very flexible. Like there's a switch that has a ball on the end of a stick. It used to be called the Ultimate Switch. It goes by a couple different names. And it's on a gooseneck, so a flexible mount. That one you can hit in any direction. So I always like to have that one with me. I like to have a jelly bean switch or something that does the same as that. I like to have a proximity switch. So just like what Michael was using, or the door getting into Publix, I like to have a proximity switch because sometimes the person has such fine motor movement and light touch that they can't even activate like a jelly bean switch. That's just too much motor movement, too much resistance for them. All right, I chose to stop sharing my screen, so that way I was thinking I would go full size, but that didn't go for me, but that's okay. Maybe it's just my setting. Do you have any stylus recommendations for direct select access used for an iPad for an adult? So this one's a really interesting one. The stylus, there are styluses or styluses, styli, that can connect to a head pointing device. A mouth stick can have a stylus on the end. There are kinds that are just kind of physical pen shape. There are some that have like a Y. If I say pen again, I'm gonna put I think pen again. It's a pen that looks like this, but there are stylus that look like that as well. I'd be remiss if I didn't say the organization hosting this webinar, FAST, has a lending library. So if you are not familiar with the different objects that are out there, talk with Carolyn. Carolyn, are you running the lending library? Are you overseeing it at least, right?
Yes, so we are the local RDC here in Orlando. If you're in Florida, there are 12 RDCs, so there might be one more conveniently located to you. If you're joining us from another state in the US, go to AT3 that has every state's Tech Act program. Every state has one. So your state would have a lending library of its own. And we have here, I don't remember the last time you visited us, Matthew, but all of our switches are actually on a wall. And I encourage people to just come in and sit down and play with them because they do feel different. They have durability that Matthew mentioned, different amounts of resistance. So for clients who have a lot of extraneous movement or require more sensitivity. So it's a great opportunity to do that, but prior to just having to go and make a recommendation or purchase. So thank you for the plug.
Yeah, and important. I'm out here in Arizona. My state agency is called ASTAP, or the Arizona Tech Act Project. That's where I borrow equipment when I'm doing evaluations as a professional. I don't even try and keep my own inventory of stuff at home for when I do evaluations. I borrow from them. There's no reason not to, at least in our state, the way things are set up. Every state might do things a little different, but there's no reason for professional development or for evaluation to not try the latest and greatest stuff and not try and keep a personal inventory for me. Oh, great. And Carolyn just threw in the AT3 link. So if you're not in Florida, that's where you would go to find out what your version of FAST or ASTAP is. To jump back to the question about styluses. So it just partly depends. If you have decreased accuracy of movement and you need to rest your hand on the screen, I've seen not only styluses used, but I've seen key guards or touch guards put across the iPad, which is great if you're using it for a static language set. So something where the buttons line up to the holes all the time. If you're using the iPad for multiple things or screens that change and the buttons aren't in the same places as far as button size and location, then that can really mess you up because now a button you might need could be blocked by a touch guide or a key guard. The other trick that I've seen close to that for the stylus is we know that with the iPad, it uses what's called capacitive touch. So that means it takes body contact, right? Or the stylus, the little piece of rubber. If you put a glove on, you can't activate the touch screen. And you can experience this, well, I'm talking to people that live in the same kind of winter as I do, right? Like we wear gloves. But on those few cold mornings where you might actually wear a glove and then you wanted to text someone on your cell phone, you have to take the glove off, right? Or you have to buy the glove that has the special capacitive touch built into the index finger. So you could go that route as a potential stylus type recommendation. Obviously, I don't know much about the person, Amanda, but if they can get to the button by resting their screen and then touch with the index finger, then that glove with the capacitive touch, or the poor man's version of that is you take a glove, you cut a slit right where like the first index, oh my gosh, joint, the IP joint of the index finger, but where the distal phalanx is here, you could cut a slit right there and you could pull just that one finger out. Or if you needed to, you could cut just the tip off of the glove of the mitten for that index finger. So then they could slide their finger all over and the only exposed part that would activate the iPad would be just that finger. So it kind of depends on that exact situation. When you say decreased accuracy of movement, could they stabilize their wrist against the device and then activate with a much more accurate index finger? So it's one of those, well, hold on, I need more information, but hopefully that gives you some ideas. And you're very welcome, Amanda. So what other questions? I didn't see anything else come in the chat log, but don't be bashful, throw anything out there. And if you didn't get to ask today, you have my cell phone number. It was on the opening slide. Carolyn can share that out. So you have my cell phone, you have access to me. I'm happy to do some consulting over the phone or through email, stuff like that.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And we appreciate you sharing all of your information like that as well with us here today.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
And I'm going to add some of those links. So we've been sending out a email message to everybody after given sessions. So I'm going to put some of those links and things that Matthew shared with us here today as well as a reference for you. Couple of quick reminders. We are also going to drop in the chat a post-session survey. For this one is a little bit more geared toward kind of the content in these presentations. Again, we appreciate your participation in these surveys. It is not a requirement. You get CEUs for participating either way, but it is much appreciated. Other reminders, so next week, same time, 12 o'clock, we have Navigating the Waters of Education Employment with Faye Warren. Faye is local here in Orlando and will be presenting using her AAC system and talking about her experiences, things that went well for her and things that maybe hindered some of her progress as a person who uses AAC. So we are greatly looking forward to that presentation. There is a Qualtrics link if you would like to submit a case study for the team to go over for any of these presentations coming up. I'm always happy to have them, and then we can troubleshoot as a community anything going on in your practice. And of course, all of those links are being shared on the ECHO website that we do have up and running at this time. As a reminder, we are offering ASHA CEUs for these presentations. That follow-up email has an attached CEU form. It does need to be filled out and returned, but we will be holding all of those until the end of the series. We have sessions running through the end of November. So that way, if you are coming and going from different presentations, you'll get credit for every presentation that you attend. We are posting the recordings of these sessions, as I mentioned in the chat earlier. You can watch any of them on our YouTube channel, and we appreciate you sharing those with your colleague. But as a reminder, only CEUs are only offered for those participating in the live sessions. One more time, those are our contacts here. We appreciate everybody who came today. Hope to see some of you back next week. And a huge thank you again for Matthew for sharing such great information. That was wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Bye, everybody. I will see you hopefully next week.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. All right, Carolyn, I am going to run off to my conference.
Enjoy. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you. Bye.